Good evening. Welcome to our fourth edition of Forging Futures. From the first moments, Reverend Mandy, Tina Lewis, Director of Membership and Engagement, Steve Cooper, Director of Religious Education, and myself started imagining what we call Forging Futures. Having Professor Sharon Welch as a guest speaker was on our year one mandatory list. Forging Futures was conceived to deliver Tina, she's right over there, Tina's idea of deepening the grounding of our congregation in Unitarian Universalism. Our first idea was to find speakers who had firm ideas of where Unitarian Universalism could or should go theologically or otherwise. Leaning on our connection to Dr. Elias Ortega, who is with us tonight, who is the president of Meadville Lombard Theological School, we invited him and two speakers he suggested to our first event. Elias introduced first Dr. Pamela Lightsey, who spoke about the Meadville Lombard approach to educating potential UU ministers. So I get this to go in the right direction. Hold on, folks. I may have to wing it. I might have to wing it, okay. She was followed by Michael Hogue, and Michael Hogue spoke passionately about theological naturalism. Our second guest expanded us by making us realize that we could learn from non-UUs who basically shared our values. Dr. Kate Ott was here, and she spoke about the intersection of tech, faith, and sexuality. Our third Forging Futures, we were looking for somebody who was doing something unusual in the world of Unitarianism. And we had Reverend David Pyle, who is a minister, a UU minister in the United States Army. And tonight, we are graced with Sharon Welch, who will be properly introduced by Reverend Mandy. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Chris, is this microphone on? Awesome. Dr. Sharon Welch is a social ethicist and lifelong activist. Dr. Welch has long worked within the peace movement and women's movement and is now working with others to address the challenges of systemic racism and rising explicit racial violence and white nationalism. She's begun working with the League of Women Voters in order to enact foundational criminal justice reform and to counter rising authoritarianism by expanding the core strengths of an inclusive and generative democratic system. Dr. Welch was Provost and Professor of Religion and Society at Meadville Lombard Theological School from 2000 to 2017 and has held positions as Professor and Chair of Religious Studies, Professor of Women's and Gender Studies, and Adjunct Professor of Educational Leadership and Policy and Analysis at the University of Missouri. She was assistant and then associate professor of theology at Harvard Divinity School, and she received her PhD in theology from Vanderbilt University. She received honorary doctorates from both Meadville Lombard and Starr King School for the Ministry, and was named the Alumna of the Year by Vanderbilt Divinity School in 2019. Dr. Welch is a member of the Unitarian Universalist Peace Ministry Network, the Commission on Social Witness of the UUA, the Advisory Council of the Community-Based Global Learning Collaborative, and the Board of the Chicago League of Women Voters. Dr. Welch is author of 6 books, and you all should have a flyer. On the back side is a QR code for her most recent text. We welcome Dr. Welch here. We are so honored to have you.
Well, thank you, Reverend Mandy, and thanks all of you. It is an an honor to be with you and be part of this conversation. And I want to again thank Reverend Mandy. I want to thank Neil. I'm going to get this right. Lichtman. Neil Lichtman. I want to make sure I got it right. Tina Lewis and Steve Cooper for the invitation. And one of the things I was so excited about this opportunity to be with you is that from talking to Reverend Mandy and looking at your website, you all are already doing the work of generative democracy. Now, I don't think this is the particular language that you use, but you're already doing that work, and you're already doing that work in a way I think is very essential for Unitarian Universalists across the world to do this work and provide the kind of ethical and aesthetic grounding that we need to counter white nationalism and to create communities of generative belonging. Now, what I'm going to do is I've got some questions for you that I'm going to have at the end. And I'm going to give you an outline next of the overview. But at the end, after I finish, I've got 3 questions for you. I'm going to describe what generative democracy is. And then what I want to know is how much are the practices of generative democracy at the core of what you are already doing now in your congregational, your professional, and civic lives to resist authoritarianism and to enact systemic justice. To enact systemic justice, transformative justice. So how are you already doing it? The second, are there limits to the work of generative democracy? And third, are there other dimensions of generative democracy that are essential in addition to the ones that I haven't mentioned? So those are the questions for you at the end. And the overview, this is what I'm going to cover. I'm going to go over the essential work that is being done now by you and by other people throughout the world that are essential as we counter authoritarianism and build communities of generative interdependence. So I'm going to look at the political science of what's being involved now. Secondly, how this political work that is being done by you and others relates to the practices of generative democracy. And third, I'm going to explore the values that are at the center of generative democracy. And fourth, the practices that empower this work. And in describing the practices, I'm going to explore a humanist definition of spirituality. So a humanist understanding of spiritual practices that are essential to the work of generative democracy. And then for all of these, there's the bibliography that's available for you to pick up. It's all the footnotes. Now, the essential work that is being done now is, I'm curious, I attended this meeting on April 3rd. It was Zoom, and it was at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation, the Harvard Kennedy School. And it was 2 leading political scientists, Erica Chenoweth and Stephen Levitsky. And the theme was backsliding and resistance in the United States. And they were describing what is happening now, what's falling apart, and what the resistance is to it. And Erica Chenoweth, they're both professors at the Kennedy School and at Harvard. And did any of you happen to watch that webinar? Okay. What they've both done is in their work is, so they're really the experts in this. Erica Chenoweth wrote this wonderful book with Maria Stefan. It was published. It is called Why Civil Resistance Works. I think it came out in 2011. And what she had done, it was looking at the political science. They looked at every single resistance movement from 1900 to 2008 and found strategic nonviolence was more successful in countering authoritarianism than violent resistance. And Stephen Levitsky, he wrote this book, How Democracies Die. And it was looking at what happened in Europe and in Latin America. And in describing what is happening now, they were really clear in describing there are 2 forms of political activism that are essential to prevent the death of democracy in the United States and to resist authoritarianism. Now, the first is coalitions of resistance to authoritarianism, and the second is coalitions that are building just democratic systems. And what's really key that Levitsky was saying is in terms of the resistance, that we need a broad-based coalition that's united against an authoritarian government. We might not agree on everything that we're for, but we're united against authoritarianism. And in talking about, and there's so many, and again, so we're united against it, But there are multiple forms of resistance. It's not just one thing. And so there's the need for the kind of protest, the hands-off. There's the need for the kind of speeches that we're getting from Bernie Sanders and AOC. There's the need for the lawsuits that are being filed. And again, what we have, some universities and some law firms are refusing to cooperate with the attempts to stop their action. And so he said what is incredible is that we do have multiple forms of resistance. You find where you have the levers. Now, one of the things that I wanted to ask is, I know a few of you were at the Hands Off rally, and one of the things that was so brilliant about this were the multiple forms of resistance. What were some of the posters that you found especially compelling? What? Free Luigi. Oh, I'm sorry. That's good. IKEA is good. Yeah. Well, again, it's kind of the resistance. What was so powerful about this is Levitsky, and say for them to continue, is you don't have to have the same thing that you're definitely opposed to, but you're there that you're opposed, that this is something that needs to be stopped. Also, and this is one of the things that I think is kind of different, and I wanted to ask you what your experience was like being there, is that Levitsky calls this first form of coalition a negative coalition. Now, I think that misses, my experience, I've been involved in demonstrations, since I was in the 70s in high school, and while there's a resistance, to me it's never felt completely negative. It's also an affirmation of feeling like, well, other people care about this. I'm not alone. And like you said, some of the, with the posters, the humor in it. So there's a place both for rage, but it's also positive. It's an affirmation of a kind of joy. And so I'm curious, what was it like for you? What was those of you who were at that protest or at others, what does it feel like? Solidarity. And solidarity is not just negative. There's a real joy in having that as well. Now, then the other thing, and y'all are doing this as well, too, because there's a solidarity in being clear what we're opposed to. And this is dangerous, and it has to be stopped. What Chenoweth talked about, and this is in some ways more difficult, now how do we build something that has not just vision, but also has the policies to bring it alive? So something has the power of like a Green New Deal. What does it mean to come together? And also, the thing that in her work is so important to realize, and I talk about it in my book, is that, again, strategic nonviolence, we defeat ourselves because there are multiple levers of power and there are multiple institutions that have to change. And you find where you can make a difference and work with other people, and we do that in resonance with each other. And in some ways, it's easier for us to defeat this autocracy because we already have a democracy. Now, it's a very imperfect one, but we're not having to start from scratch. And so we could begin the work of radically improving our democracy, but we don't have to invent the very basic structures. Now, this is what gets to the work that you all are doing, your Justice Initiative. So there are many ways of acting. It's there. Not everyone has to do the same thing. Not everyone can do them all. But you know when you act, your solidarity, you're not alone. Okay. Now, this is one of the things that I want to, this was new to me, and I don't know how much new to you, is describing what we do when we come together to both resist and build, and looking at it in the context of generative democracy. Now, I had never even heard the term generative democracy until the fall of 2018. It was one of my former students, Kwok Pui-Lan, who's professor of theology and political science at Emory, and she invited me to attend a webinar that they were doing at the American Academy of Religion on the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement, and then she asked me to write a chapter for a book that she was doing and the lessons that could be learned from that pro-democracy movement. And what really surprised me is Benny Tai, who's one of the founders of it, he described the difference between competitive democracy and deliberative democracy. Now, competitive democracy, you go in, you've got the right answer, you try to get everybody to support you. Deliberative democracy is you listen to each other to say, okay, what are the multiple concerns? What are the different ways of responding to them? And that you create new solutions together. It's not just us against them. Someone else who describes this in real detail is Stanley Dietz. And he calls it, it's the same practices, but he calls it generative democracy. And the key, again, is not you just expressing or me expressing what I think. It's we get together, and this gets into the Buddhist understanding of knowing and non-knowing. I express what I think, you express what you think, and we learn together. A deeper sense of what is happening, what can happen, and the way we can act. And one of the things that you'll notice that my book that I have the flyer for, it came out in January 2019, and I just found out about generative democracy in the fall of 2018. So the term isn't in that book, but the practices are when I talk about democracy. And in the book that I'm doing now, my revised edition of After Empire, I explicitly talk about generative democracy. Now some more about what generative democracy is. Dietz describes it is that you invite, when you come into this kind of like Buddhist thing of knowing and non-knowing, and you're looking at basic issues like economic sustainability, ecological sustainability, social sustainability, how to get our electoral system to work better, you invite challenges to existing positions. And so rather than assuming that what is fixed has to remain in place, if we just get everybody to work with it, it's the opposite. Well, what else can we try to get people to be more involved in the democratic system? And how can we learn together how to really listen and grow? Now, one of the things that really surprised me about this, and it was very concrete, I attended a presentation on community engagement by law enforcement oversight agencies. And because I work on this issue with the Chicago League of Women Voters. And in this presentation, there were people from the University of Illinois, Chicago, and the program that they have, it's Institute for Policy and Civic Engagement. And they said, now this is how you need to get the feedback from the community to really work with law enforcement. And they had people get together. They were sitting in tables of like 12 to 13 people. You ask questions. You've got time for open-ended questions. You take notes. And it's things you want to ask, but you're also eager to get things that you haven't heard before. And it was such a completely different process than the competitive democracy. My district council, that's oversight of policing, the way they do their feedback sessions, you stand up and you can talk 2 minutes, and after 2 minutes, they'll cut you off even mid-sentence. I mean, it's not a real kind of give and take of learning and listening to growing together and what it means to really initiate that kind of thing. Now, this work, and this is some really good news, and some of you may know this in your work in education or other people who are doing it. There's a major effort to transform civic education, K through higher ed, to really get in the practices of generative democracy. And again, this particular term isn't being used, but the practices are there. When I was first kind of aware of this, I attended a conference, again, it was Zoom, and it was really powerful. It was February 2023, and it was hosted by the Civic Learning and Democracy Coalition. It was at the University of Virginia, and this was university provost presidents, department chairs. And what I've really appreciated by this is they began with a straightforward acknowledgement that they said, we have all failed. We have failed in civics education because if we had done things better, we would not be in the situation of extreme polarization and resistance. And so the whole thing is we have to change our practices in fundamental ways. There was a follow-up conference that was in October 2024, and they described new forms of practices that have already been implemented at 77 universities, and they're changing accreditation standards for all of these. Could I have the first slide, please? Yeah, so this is the big overview of the framework for college civic learning and democracy engagement. And it's grounded in years of experience and big goals. And I'm going to go through some of the more details. So the next slide, please. Now, one of the things that I think is so fascinating about this, okay, this includes some of the things that you would expect in civics education. You know, constitutionalism, political systems, the basic founding and freedom text, the historical and comparative knowledge of the U.S. and global freedom movements, but also a study of authoritarianism and anti-democracy movements. And also what I think is especially significant is that last point, guided reflection on students' experiences and views of democracy. And so you want to know the students coming in there, well, have they grown up where it seems like it matters? That that's how they can have agency, it's addressing real problems, or not? And so it's grounding and listening to the students. And again, one of the key things about this framework is, again, it's every student, every major gets this kind of training. It's a norm. Now the second thing, the next slide, please. Okay, here, one of the things that's really key, and this is learning this thing in whatever your major is, whether it's physics, whether it's art history, whether it's nursing, is bridge building and problem solving skills. So how do we learn to work and think together? I think one of the things that's so interesting is, the second one, critical inquiry and evidence-based reasoning. And then productive engagement with diverse views, where you feel like there's a kind of joy that comes in someone seeing something you'd never thought about. And you learn this and you experience it. And then problem solving with diverse partners. And you realize they know things that you had never thought about. And then ethical reasoning about, well, what are alternative ways of solving this? And one of the things that I think, again, is key, it's practice across all majors. Right? So every major learns this form of reasoning. Now the third slide, please. Now this one is really key, because what they found, this was the first conference in February, that what really made a difference in students getting this sense of creative, generative democracy, and civic engagement is if they have in their very first year a concrete community engagement project where they work with the community to solve real problems. The language for this used to be called service learning, but now they're moving it to community engagement, because it's not just the experts from the university helping the communities. It's genuinely working and learning together. And one of the things that they found so important is that they do this every student their first year. And one of the things that they found, that students do this, if they do this in their first year, they're more likely to graduate, they're more likely to become civic engaged, and they have a clear sense of what they want to do as a major. And so one of the things, collaborative, and they still here call it service learning, but other people call it engagement. But in courses, community-based problem solving, research projects, government agencies, and then, and this is another thing that's really critical, is guided reflection on what it's like to do this. I mean, how it feels to have other people see the world so differently than you, and what it means to learn from that, and the way in which that can kind of be a thrill, and also it can be threatening. And how do we, hold the complexity of all of those? And some of the kind of projects that do this sort of work is Santa Clara University. They have projects where they had like after-school programs for young girls in under-resourced communities where they did sports, but doing sports as a means of doing leadership training. Another one of my colleagues, Kanja Mehta, is at Lehigh University. You work with the community and see where they're experiencing in their neighborhoods environmental challenges, and explore together how those can be addressed. And so again, it's problem solving, it's giving skills on a very, very concrete way. Now, one of the things that I love about doing this work is there's another organization that supports, and especially this shift from service learning to community engagement. And some of you, again, might be part of this or know people are. It's the Engagement Scholarship Consortium. And these are universities that they've changed their mission from teaching to research, and mutually beneficial community engagement. And one of the things that they do is, so how do you really learn what's going on and you build on the strengths of the community? And it's one of the things I love about the academic world. The second conference that I went to with other faculty, you could sign up randomly to be a moderator. You're just going to help out. And so randomly, I was assigned to be the moderator for a panel that was done by Kanjan Mehta, who was then at Penn State. And he's the creator of this whole new field, humanitarian engineering and social entrepreneurship, and how in some ways engineering can become a service profession, in a sense. It's community service, it's for a greater good. And what was fascinating was he was saying that in doing this kind of work, you need not just institutional review boards, IRB, making sure that what you're doing is ethical and you have proper consent, but ERB, engagement review boards, because every time you do this, when you're really listening to the community, things that you thought would be fine aren't. There are going to be surprises, and so how do you have this ongoing practice of inviting, growing, learning together, and expecting critiques? Now, third, what are the values that lead to this kind of generative democracy? Why do you want to take this on? Figuring out how to really solve problems together. Now, I've got a question for you. There's, the political science is really, in some ways, it's pretty clear about what drives authoritarianism. And there's a kind of consensus that there's about 25% of the population that remains authoritarian. So there's another 25% that's committed to a kind of emancipated individualism. And there's 50% that can go either way. And the way this is measured is people don't ask specifically about political positions, but child-rearing values. And this research, it's really compelling in what it shows, and as compelling in what it leaves out. And so I've got an experiment that I want to do with you all. I want you to think for just a few minutes, what are 2 child-rearing values that you think are really important? Either the way you were raised, or the way you have raised your children, or you see other people raising their children. So just, you don't have to say it out loud now, but just kind of think. 2 child-rearing values. Have a show of hands if you're ready. Have you thought of some? Okay. Please, I'm going to skip to the slide that's the one of child-rearing values, please. Yes, so move to the no. Okay, now what I love about these, I'm going to read them. It's like they're set up, and it's not only what they have as values, but what's set against each other. And I'm going to read these, and then I want to hear if you have some values that aren't reflected. So Karen Stinner, the authoritarian dynamic, obeying one's parents or thinking for oneself, respecting elders or following one's conscience, following the rules, exercising good judgment, being well-mannered, being responsible for one's own actions, being neat and clean, being interested in how and why things happen. And then Hetherington and Weiler, a different set, respect for elders or independence, obedience or self-reliance, good manners or curiosity, well-behaved or considerate. So I'm curious, do you have any values that aren't reflected? Kindness, yes. Neil.
Listening.
Yes, listening.
Loving everyone.
Loving everyone? Yes. Yeah. Honesty, yes. Anyone else?
Trust.
Trust.
Empathy and respect.
Empathy and respect, definitely. Yeah. No.
Critical thinking.
Oh, yes, critical thinking. No, it's, I've every place that I've asked, I've given this. This has happened, and I can remember some of the things that you've mentioned, and too, ones that were left out. Like, honestly, when I asked my daughters, they're 38 and 35 now, and my youngest daughter said, yeah, honesty. And by honesty, she meant being honest when you've made a mistake. Not just honest, calling someone else honest, yeah, I messed up, and I'm going to do better. And also, I loved this one, that division between respect for elders and independence. Okay, my oldest daughter, Zoe, not only is she a yoga teacher, she teaches radical forms of yoga, power yoga, with all this incredible music and paddleboard yoga and all these different forms. And she's one of the most creative, independent people I've ever heard. And when they asked her respect for elders or independence, she just laughed out loud and said, well, of course, respect for elders. Without them, I wouldn't be independent. Right? And so that kind of both, and also the way I was raised, the reason for being well behaved is because you were considerate. You know, you were thinking about other people's needs. You were being kind. You were having empathy. It wasn't just following rules. Now, what is so clear in these scales is they don't reflect the other options that we actually have as human beings. It's not just cohesive community based on rules and hierarchy or emancipated individualism. There's a way of trust and empathy and being in community with each other. And one of the things that's so fascinating is that, in their 2018 study, Hetherington and Weiler, they did another book, and I've got the reference there. In this new study of it, they excluded people of color from their study because their answers didn't match these divisions. So rather than seeing there's a different understanding of belonging. There's different values. And what's really here, and this is something that we see in many communities of color, and I see it in so many Unitarian communities as well, is we have here, it's not just cohesive community, emancipated individualism, it's generative interdependence. Our value, it's how to use our individual gifts in responsible service to a larger good. A community that values diversity and connection, creativity and scientific rigor, responsibility for others and the freedom to find how you can best acknowledge that responsibility, and creating these expansive communities of connection, respect, and cooperation. Now, there's another thing that's very exciting in the evolving political science is I'm sure you're all well aware of the typical divide where there's a difference between if you've got strong in-group empathy, you've got out-group hostility. And so it's in-group, out-group. Well, there's some political scientists who've written a really important book that came out in 2021, and it's called Seeing Us and Them, Social Divisions and the Politics of Group Empathy. And it's Sigmund Siren, Nicholas Valentino, and Jose Villalobos, Seeing Us and Them. And what they found, that it's true that among many white communities, and this is a quote from other book, it says, whites who identify more strongly with their in-group display lower levels of out-group empathy. Okay. And they also have in-group favoritism, out-group discrimination. But this is the quote continuing. But for minorities, the relation is instead positive. Our results show that higher in-group identification is indeed associated with higher levels of out-group empathy among both blacks and Latinos. Now, they haven't studied yet other groups, but the studies in the United States of these two groups, they found the stronger in-group identity. Minorities who identify strongly with their in-group and thus embrace their collective histories, memories, and experiences are much more likely than low-group identifiers to develop empathy for other marginalized groups. It's a win-win. It's both and. It says group empathy theory shows that in-group identification can facilitate rather than hinder out-group empathy. And they said this is also true of some white groups. And I quote, intergroup empathy has the potential to be fostered among members of every race and ethnicity. And you know, I kind of think y'all are doing that. I think that's what Unitarian Universalism does at its best. We have a strong sense of who we are and where we came from and our successes and our failures, and that empowers us to care more for other people rather than just caring for ourselves. Now, at the core of this kind of form of belonging is what Willie James Jennings describes in education and belonging. Willie James Jennings is an academic scholar, and he wrote this powerful book, After Whiteness in Education and Belonging, and I've known Willie for years. He was on the faculty at Duke Divinity School, and now he's at Yale. And you all might have a chance to hear him. He's going to be at Meadville this spring. He's been given an honorary degree. And in this new book, What's So Powerful, After Whiteness, he's very critical for whiteness, and this is a quote, "Whiteness is a type of identity in which what is elevated as the ideal is white, self-sufficient masculinity defined by possession, control, and mastery." And as you all know, this is on the rise now, of course. And I mean, in the past, it justified colonialism and slavery. And what he calls us to is a radically different form of community. And it is a form of community based on, he calls it entanglement. Entanglement, working with, learning from others. And our sense of excellence isn't just us getting our way, but it's learning a different, expansive, joyful way together. Now, this relates so much with the lesson I learned early on from the Gustavo Gutierrez, who's one of the creators of the field of liberation theology, Latin American theology in the 1970s. And he said, and I think this is really key, the theology of liberation frees the oppressed from their exploitation and marginalization. The theology of liberation frees the oppressor from our isolation, alienation, and arrogance. It frees all of us to a more expansive, joyful, creative way of being together. Now, the last point, a humanist understanding of spirituality. So what does it take to live out cultures of generative belonging? What are some of the specific practices that can help that happen? I was so lucky to encounter the need for such practices. My very first day on the job, when I was hired to be Director of Women's Studies at the University of Missouri-Columbia. So my first day on the job, and I sit down with Casey Morrison, who's the Vice Provost for Academic Excellence, and he asked me, he said, "All right, Sharon, welcome to the University of Missouri, welcome to your new role as Director of Women's Studies. Now, how often do you work out and what music do you listen to?" Because he said, this job is so stressful. You need to have the physical resilience. You need to have the music that holds your pain as well as your joy, as well as your anger. And this has to be a part. And I remember laughing out loud and just saying, oh, well, yeah, I work out some, but not enough. And started working out every day, and I did it during the work hours at the gym that was for faculty. So that was part of my work, to do that. And listening to the music. And the music for me is jazz that does that. And what was so interesting is what KC was talking about, described what I learned from my parents growing up. Because I've been, since I was in graduate school, I've been a mystic, a political activist, and an atheist. Now, I know that's kind of an odd combination, but it's one that I came to naturally because I was raised, my parents, their kind of Christian tradition, was spirituality was inextricably bound with politics. And the motive for prayer and service wasn't guilt, it wasn't duty, but it was living fully, deeply, and well. For them, spirituality, life was spirituality, and spirituality was life. And it was working for more expansive forms of justice. My father was on the Farmers Union, the Farmers Co-op. My mother was involved in creating forms of education that people who before had to be educated at home or in residential things because they were neurodivergent or had physical challenges, and getting that education in the schools. They were some of the first members of PFLAG, Parents and Friends for Lesbian and Gays. And so whenever I would see them, it was that there was different ways. Spirituality wasn't about life after death or having things right. It was full engagement with the world around you. And I remember one of the things that really shook me out of a narrow understanding of religion is in the 70s, and I don't know if anybody remember this, but in 1971 I was hitchhiking. We did that a lot then. And one of the stories that was going around was that people hitchhiking, and they pick up a hitchhiker, and the hitchhiker telling them that Jesus was going to return soon, and then the hitchhiker disappearing. It was an angel. So you've heard that story. And so I didn't see that. It didn't happen to me. I didn't pick up a hitchhiker that disappeared. But I'd heard the story, and I remember I told my dad, and I thought he'd find that interesting. He'd be thrilled, this announcement of the imminent return of the Messiah. That's a pretty big deal. And his response was, I just loved it. He said, well, Sharon, I don't know if people really saw an angel or not, but what I want to know, did it change their life? Did it make them a better person? Now, this is a humanist understanding of spirituality. What are the spiritual practices that make us better people? What are the practices that enable us to learn from and roll with critique, hold the grief as well as the joy? And what role can we play as communities in doing this? Now, I feel very lucky, again, where I've learned some of this is I was able to work for over a decade with the poet, activist, professor, Carolee Sanchez, who's from the Laguna Pueblo. And one of the things I learned, it was this kind of irony of, I had a book on feminist things where our essays were next to each other. And mine was just a feminist critique of everything that was going wrong. And hers was a form of ethics and political engagement grounded in the beauty way and what it means to acknowledge the depth of that. And it was so interesting when I read that because my stance, I was just the perpetual outsider criticizing everything. Criticizing for sexism, for racism, for classism, and this is what my friends would I do. And then my daughter Zoe, her just wholehearted embrace of the joys of life and the wonder and the smell of lilacs and the taste of cherries and seeing the stars and how do we hold both of those. And from Carolee, I learned, and this is one of the things that she described, is the beauty way. We ground ourselves in practices of beauty and gratitude. And she never taught us the specific Laguna rituals at all. She invited us to create our own. How do we, on a daily basis, ground ourselves in the beauty? And then another thing that's actually clear, not only grounding ourselves in the beauty of the world and the people who are around us, a reminder that for Indigenous people, living in cooperation in environmentally responsible ways with the natural world, it's not genetic. It's not based on some kind of natural proclivity. In fact, it's the opposite. She said it's grounded in remembering the times, the errors in the past in which balance was lost, this is a quote, because of greed or misuse of the environment, over hunting, over fishing, and failing to share resources in an equitable manner. You tell the stories. Your in-group empathy is you remember the failures as well as the values. And you learn from those. That's also part of the work that I'm sure, in talking to Reverend Mandy, that many of you know, Robin Wall Kimmerer, braiding sweetgrass, and that kind of awareness that we need to be continually aware of the threat of the Wendigo. In this quote, the Wendigo, a person driven by greediness with a heart as cold as ice, only focused on their own needs. Once focused only on one's own needs, the longing for more becomes both insatiable and ruthless, even leading one to experience pleasure in taking from others and causing pain to others. We see this in a few places in our political environment right now. It's on. And then what she offers, of course, instead, how do we learn from this past and embrace a different one? This is a quote, Robin Wall Kimmerer. Each of us comes from people who were once Indigenous. We can reclaim our membership in the cultures of gratitude. Reclaim your membership in a culture of gratitude that formed our old relationships with the living earth. Gratitude is a powerful antidote to the Wendigo psychosis. A deep awareness of the gifts of the earth and of each other is medicine. The practice of gratitude lets us hear the badgering of markets as those stomach grumblings of the Wendigo. It celebrates cultures of regenerative reciprocity, where wealth is understood to be having enough to share, and riches are counted in mutually beneficial relationships. Plus, it makes us happy. Now, while we can find antidotes to the Wendigo, we cannot destroy this ongoing threat. And we need to remain vigilant, both in nurturing reciprocity, respect, and checking the greed and the isolation. Now, the role of humanist spiritual practices, the role of this community. We are not alone in honoring the bounties of life, and we are not alone in doing whatever we can to counter this growing authoritarianism and the devaluation and the dehumanization and the taking of human lives. And yet we do this work grounded in beauty, because you all are worth the struggle, as you are, as this bountiful ecosystem that sustains us. Now, I'm going to go back. My questions for you, and then other questions and comments. So, getting back to the beginning, my questions for you. How much are the practice of generative democracy at the core of what you are doing now in your congregational, professional, and civic lives to resist authoritarianism and to enact systemic justice? How are you already acknowledging mistakes and learning from others and finding new ways of working together? And then, are there limits to the work of generative democracy? And third, are other dimensions of generative democracy essential in addition to the ones that I've mentioned? So, thoughts, comments? Yes.
Can I be heard?
No. Chris, can you turn the fan on? There you go.
Was that it? That's it? No. Okay. What I struggle with in trying to do something like this are a couple of things. One is, and Mandy and I have talked about this, one is suppressing my anger. Okay, so I get into a situation where I try to be calm, and I know I'm not. My instinct is to put a metaphorical bullet into the situation to just end it on my terms, my point of view, as opposed to listening and trying to understand where the person is really coming from. But then the other part is being prepared for this and realizing if there's going to be dialogue, I better know what I'm talking about. That takes a lot of work too. I mean, it isn't just throwing yourself into the situation of, I don't want to use the word debate, because I don't think that's what you're talking about. It's the opposite of that, but somehow understanding a way to hear another person where you can take something from what really good listening allows and try to build on it. Like, I heard what you said, but I also heard this, and then build on that. But I feel like I got to go to school to learn how to do this.
Well, one of the things, I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because one of the key things, and this is for me like a humanist spirituality, it's what I learned from Casey Morrison, The Reason to Work Out. For me, working out that's fierce and listening to music that's fierce, that's how I fully express my anger. And if I don't have that kind of workout where I rage several times during the week, I can't listen. Now, and that's why, in terms of different forms of yoga, some forms of yoga that are really calm, that's not mine. I've got to get the, because that's there, and feeling that anger, it shows that you're alive and you care, but you find a way to express it that leads to healing rather than lashing out in the moment. And again, this is why there are multiple forms. This isn't necessarily for everyone, but for many of us, having that physical outlet where we fully rage then makes it possible to be in constructive agreement where we don't rage at them then. We've pounded it out. Other.
I really like what you're saying. It reflects my social work values.
Oh,
I'm a retired social worker. But there's this, I think about, maybe it's unfair to say this, those are, my social work values are idealistic. They're aspirational. And then there's the reality in the world of people fighting over scarce resources, and it's hard to have a higher Maslow pyramid of needs discussion with people when they're really fighting for basic survival. And it almost, there's a part of me that would fear being naive about embracing an attempt at dialogue when behind the scenes people are competitive and are going to take advantage of any openness and vulnerability that I have. So I don't know how you balance that kind of thing.
Well, no, I think it's really important to do that, and realizing that, some people have kind of skills. You probably know the group. It used to be called Braver Angels. It might be something by now, that people who train and do that. There are others, but there's also a sense of both acknowledging that one of the things that we can do, and especially when you look at that, of people who want to just exploit and control. Okay, now is this better? Thank you. That's what's causing it to ring. I was beginning to think I was too close. Thank you. That was causing the ringing. But for example, that's why, and I'm sure a lot of you are probably doing this. So we know there's an economy that's the Wendigo, extraction, exploited. There's also a growing economy that's the opposite. Certified benefit corporations, benefit all, People, Planet, Profit, Social Enterprise Alliance, Social Enterprise World Forum. And these are groups where people are creating different ways of sharing wealth. And in a sense, one of the things that you do is you don't necessarily, you organize, well, in some ways you do, you boycott. You could boycott the exploitive, but you support the reciprocity and the plenitude and the generosity. And going back to that statistic of there being 25% authoritarian, 25% not, 50 in the middle, percent going for the 50%, and trying to create. And one of the things I think is so fascinating of where this is being done is one of my friends, Aaron Thompson, who used to be at the University of Missouri, but now he's head of post-secondary education for Kentucky, for the state of Kentucky. And they're getting this form of civic education for every student, every major, where you get a sense of meaning in whatever your profession is, being part of a greater good and feeling the power of that and supporting each other, and even beginning to do that K through 12. And one of the places where that's done, for example, is in Amsterdam, where kids in middle school get an experience of what is it like to have a regenerative business, and what's it like to do a business in a way that meets genuine goods. And so in some ways, what we're doing really is trying to, the negative, it's outnumbering them. Not necessarily defeating them, bringing them down, but providing this education that the joy of this is so much more contagious and rewarding and resilience, and that give everyone the chance to do that, and then contain the Wendigo the way you contain the bullies, but give everyone a chance to experience this more fulsome, respectful way of belonging. Other answers to the questions, or just other questions, comments?
Thank you so much. It's really good to hear you again. Everything that you say, and you said about generative democracy and practices and the ways that we can, actually a phrase that you didn't use, but build communities of resistance and solidarity, which is the name of Sharon's first book.
Yeah, that was my first book.
Which I read in my undergrad.
Yeah.
Is that the moment that we're in seems to be so a little bit past us being able to do this in ways that feel like they can make a difference, because I'm thinking of obviously attacks on education and the places where this would happen. So it makes me think that our congregations or our wider communities are the ways or the places where this has to take place now. Can you imagine that, given our current situation, the neo-fascist coup going on,
Right.
that this could actually happen in public schools, K
Yeah.
through 12? Can you see it? I think, do you have hope about that at all?
What I have joy in is knowing that there are people who are going to try to challenge it and do it in ways. One of, for examples, like as Erica Chenoweth talks about, for example, when this happened in Poland, it was universities, when they were shut down, they had literally sometimes underground universities in tunnels. They had classes outside. You know, our Sunday schools could become real schools. I mean, they are real schools. Yeah, and that kind of thing. Mutual aid societies, that we provide a place where we're providing the kind of wholesome education and the schools are doing it outside. And also knowing that there's growing groups of people, other countries. I mean, it's other countries brought down the fascists in Germany. That might be what it takes for us. So Canada and other groups coming together, and we on the inside can be there. Also, another thing remembering, and Chenoweth talks about this with, in Denmark, people who refuse to cooperate of driving the trains, so non-cooperation. But again, having communities where you know people share the anger and literally mutual aid. We might be required to feed ourselves and provide that kind of support. And the congregations are going to be essential in doing that kind of community.
If there are no more questions, let me just thank you, Sharon Walsh, for being as spectacular as we knew you would be. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Well, thank all of you. Thank you.